Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our State of IT Resilience 2018 webinar. Zerto recently partnered with industry-leading research analyst firm IDC Research to conduct a study to get the pulse of the state of IT resilience across the globe. During today's webinar, IDC will officially reveal the results of this study. My name is Avi Reichel and I'm the CIO at Zerto, joining the company in 2017. Before joining Zerto, I spent 17 years at Amdocs, where I was the Vice President of Information Systems. I'm delighted to introduce you to Phil Goodwin, Research Director from IDC. Phil has more than 30 years of IT industry experience, and he has covered the storage market since 1997 with a focus on the data protection market. I would like to thank Phil and his team for helping us learn about how businesses are simplifying IT operations and the steps they are taking to become IT resilient. As the leader in IT resilience with our IT resilience platform, we at Zerto define IT resilience as the ability to seamlessly adapt to new technology and drive IT transformation while mitigating the risk of downtime, ensuring an always-on business and the best customer experience. Digital transformation is happening and putting significant demand on IT organizations to drive it forward. We believe that building your IT to be resilient is key to successful IT and business transformation. Phil, we look forward to hearing the finding and learning from your research. Let's get started.
Great, thanks, Avi. I really appreciate the kind introduction, and it really is a pleasure to be here today to talk about the results of this research project, because I think this is a project that's going to be very interesting to IT organization leaders as well as business leaders working towards IT transformation and digital transformation, because it'll give a lot of insight into the way IT peers are approaching IT resilience as well as digital transformation, and will give people an opportunity to kind of do a little bit of self-benchmarking with respect to some of those attributes. So the things that we're going to talk about today is, first of all, I'll give a little bit of background on the IT study overview that we did so that people understand what the purpose and the direction was. Then we'll talk about some of the key findings. You know, what are the headlines? What are the key things that we took away from this study? And then dive into some of those detailed results along with the benchmarking information that I mentioned. We'll wrap it up with some conclusions about what we learned from this study, as well as the top 3 recommendations that IDC has for IT organizations as they move forward on this journey. And then Avi and I will have a little bit of dialogue with respect to some of the things that he is seeing from a Zerto perspective. Certainly has an interesting perspective as both a CIO having to make this work in his own organization, as well as looking at it from Zerto's perspective. So from a study background perspective, the objectives that we had really came into 3 things. First, we wanted to assess how truly resilient organizations were against various disruptions. And that included both IT as well as business-related disruptors. So as we asked respondents questions, we asked them from both an IT perspective as well as a business perspective. It allowed us to assess where the gaps are between business perception and IT perceptions of resilience. And I think that's important because our research is showing that at least in 40% of situations, the business unit is heavily involved in the decision around application deployment, service level requirements, and so on and so forth. And that percentage is really only increasing. And then the third part was to develop some benchmark criteria that people can use for assessing their own business resilience. It was a worldwide study. We included 500 respondents from all various types of industries. We included primarily medium and large enterprises with more than 1,000 employees. And what I think was significant is that we really had participation to a very high degree from very senior roles in these organizations. And I have to tell you, that's encouraging because it's actually a little bit rare to get that kind of participation from senior business leaders as well as senior CIOs and people who are really at the top echelons of decision making within these organizations. Now I want to switch a little bit and talk about what some of those key findings are, and this is really the good stuff. I'll start by summarizing this, and then we'll dig into the details a little bit. And as a background, what you'll find is that a majority of the people surveyed have transformation projects in cloud or modernization or what have you within the next 2 years. 36% of those have an IT transformation project planned, while 31% of those have a digital transformation project. Really what we see as the difference between those two is digital transformation is really an enterprise-wide endeavor, whereas IT transformation is very specific to the IT group, but almost always in support of some kind of digital transformation project. We also found that 46% of respondents have a cloud-first strategy when it comes to new projects, and we certainly see that in application deployment, where on-premise application deployment is declining slightly, whereas most of the new application deployment is in a cloud, either a hybrid cloud or a SaaS application or multi-cloud or something of that nature. We found that 42% have data protection and recovery modernization projects that are in support of their IT transformation. 22% could be considered to be a data-driven organization. So really what that tells you is that 78% are not. And yet we find in other IDC research that a large number, roughly 70% of organizations, have the goal of becoming a data-driven organization. We also found that 90% will use cloud for data protection within the next 12 months. And I think we've really reached a tipping point in that regard. Some other interesting facts that we determined is that 93.8%, absolutely a huge percentage, expect to spend more on IT resilience in the next 12 months. 90% of them expect to use cloud for data protection, and 85% expect to need both staff, training, or both over the next 24 months. So one of the key elements here that we discovered was really a skills gap that IT organizations are having to deal with as they move to become data-driven organizations and as they move to improve their IT and organizational resilience. One of the things that came out of that is that only 7.4% of those organizations that we surveyed rated themselves as mature for business resilience. Nearly half of those have suffered an unrecoverable data event in the last 3 years. 93% have experienced a tech-related business disruption in the past 2 years. 83.8% have experienced some type of business disruptor, and I'll talk specifically about what those kind of business disruptions are, in addition to what people will see from an IT perspective. And that 77.8% have experienced a malicious attack in the past 12 months, of which 89% had suffered a successful attack. And that really tells you that these kinds of attacks occur constantly, and the rate of success of them is really simply inevitable. In fact, 39.2% of respondents to this survey suffered 5 or more data corrupting events within the past 12 months. So let's move on and get into some of the detailed information. I think those are really the headlines that will come out of this survey, but let's look at what some of the data is behind them. First of all, as we asked respondents to tell us what their priorities were for some of these transformation projects. What we noted is that of the top 4, data protection of some variety was 3 out of that top 4. Certainly a cloud-first strategy is very high on that list, and we find that repeatedly as we talk to CIOs from an IDC perspective. But cloud-based data protection is certainly one area where people are looking. Data protection modernization, disaster recovery modernization were also high priorities. IT transformation and digital transformation, surprisingly, were a little bit below that. And really what this tells me is that people are focused on some of the blocking and tackling. You know, how do we provide better resilience? How do we provide better data protection and recovery are among the highest priorities for the respondents of this particular survey. We also we also looked at these findings and found that they were further validated when we asked organizations the important data protection how important data protection was to their digital transformation and IT transformation projects. And I'll just briefly state that DX stands for digital transformation, ITX is IT transformation, in case you're not familiar with those particular monikers. You'll see here that 10.3% said data protection transformation is not a part of, or a very important part of any of these initiatives. Relatively small percent when you take a look and consider that roughly 60% find it either very important or important to their digital transformation and IT transformation projects. So data protection and the resilience that goes along with data protection is really a key part of any kind of transformation project within the scope of what these people are aiming to achieve. We then ask organizations to tell us what kind of IT resilience maturity they believe they have. And this is an area where I think organizations can do a little bit of self-benchmarking. We'll have some more of these, but I found this to be very interesting because 8.4% of these organizations rated themselves as organizations that are aggressively disrupting the use of new digital technologies and business models in effect to affect the maximum IT resilience. Really, it is interesting that it's a small percentage of organizations that are highly aggressive and are the ones that are disrupting everybody else. So this is an area where I think IT organizations can look to a maturity scale and say, okay, how do we move up that maturity scale? What are the elements of that? And these definitions give you some insight to that. So the vast majority or the plurality really of customers in that middle group believe that their business and IT goals are aligned at an enterprise level around the creation of IT resilience, but not yet focused on the maximum and integrated resilience. So you can look at these definitions and say, okay, where are we with respect to this, and kind of do a little bit of a self-assessment. Now I want to shift gears a little bit to specific data protection and resilience findings. And this first one I mentioned in some of the opening slides, but I think it really bears looking at specifically because to me this is one of the more shocking results, and that is nearly half of organizations, or specifically 49%, have suffered some kind of unrecoverable data event in the last 3 years. When you talk about data protection and recovery, really the cardinal sin of data protection is being unable to recover that data. And what we find here is that nearly half of organizations have committed that sin, if you will, in that their inability to recover data has affected their ability to continue. We also found when we dug into it that 93% of organizations have suffered some type of tech-related disruption. And in fact, 55% have suffered 4 or more disruptions in this. So those disruptions could range to anything from failed system to a disaster to malware. This really takes into account all sorts of different types of disruptions. We also wanted to find out what is some of the impact. So, okay, you suffered an event. What was the impact? And we found that in the vast majority of situations, there was some kind of impact. Only 22.9% in situations there was no impact. 35% there was minor. But you can see that in about 40% of situations, the organization suffered moderate or severe impact to it. And when you think about the situation where organizations have a number of events occurring, the odds of having a significant impact increase. So we drove into what exactly some of those results or what some of those impacts were. And we found that the biggest impact to organizations was really around people, both employee overtime, IT people having to come in, spend evenings and weekends recovering systems, as well as loss of employee productivity, which would be really line of business people unable to execute their jobs because they don't have access to the systems and applications that they need. I did make a note here that about a third of them in these situations from tech-related disruptions had lost data, and about 1 in 5 suffered major damage to company reputation. And I think that's the thing that concerns a lot of CIOs the most, is seeing their organization in the headlines of the local newspaper of having been hit by malware or been hacked and had personal information compromised and so on and so forth. And if we look at these statistics, the risk of that is about 1 in 5, which is fairly significant. We shifted gears a little bit and asked about business disruptions, and we found that 83.8% of organizations have experienced some kind of business disruption. This included the top one, which was disruptive technologies, but also included new products or services that disrupted the way a company had to do business, disruptive competitors, and even 34% had seen new business models that were disruptive to current business processes and operations. Certainly VRBO and its impact on hotels, or Uber and its impact on taxis would be probably the most high profile current examples of those sorts of things. But roughly a third of organizations have seen that kind of disruption enter their marketplace, as well as disruptive customer demands and requirements. So really, when you look at these two statistics together, you can see that nearly every organization is going to have some kind of IT disruption. The vast majority are going to have some kind of business disruption, and the results of those can be a significant impact on the organization's ability to do business. When we ask how many malicious attacks have occurred, we found that 77.8 know they've been attacked. Now, I bring that up because we see up at the top that 18.2% of organizations reported that they had not been attacked. You never know what you don't know. So my guess is that some of these organizations have been attacked and simply didn't know it. Unless you have ways of capturing that, or if there are consequences that are immediately available or obvious, then you may get attacked and not know it. But the other 77.8 know it, and interestingly, you can see how many times they've been attacked: 18% up to 50 times, 13.2% up to 100 times, and 5.6 have been attacked more than 100 times in the last 12 months. Malware is relentless. The ransomware guys are relentless. It is just simply a matter of being able to defend yourself and arm yourself as well as you possibly can to deal with these kind of disruptions, which one would have to conclude are somewhat inevitable. Of those malicious attacks, we found that 84% had suffered a successful attack. Doesn't mean all of them were successful, and certainly they were not, but 84% of organizations who know they have been attacked suffered a successful attack, whether it was a malware, and certainly this gets into the data loss situations, data corruption situations, as well as ransomware and so forth. We found that nearly 40% of organizations have suffered 5 or more data corrupting events. Again, this is within the past 12 months. So not quite half, but a very large, significant number of organizations have had to deal with quite a few data corrupting events in the past 12 months. Now, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some disaster recovery planning. And the reason this is important is not because disaster recovery per se is something that organizations would, although certainly IDC would say that is a best practice to do, but really disaster recovery is evolving from a situation where organizations are worried about tornadoes and hurricanes and floods and things like that, to where they're really disaster recovery planning is becoming much more around application availability and IT resilience than it is simply recovering from a once in a lifetime type of hurricane or tornado or flood or what have you. We can see that the kinds of disruptions that organizations face are nearly inevitable. And proper DR plan actually plays very much into that kind of organizational and IT resilience. So what we did was we asked organizations what % of their applications are covered by a DR plan. You can see that only less than 20%, 19.7%, have nearly all of their applications covered. The vast majority have somewhere between 25 and 75% of their applications covered by a DR plan. What that really tells me is that there are many, many applications that would be recovered on an ad hoc basis if they were disrupted in some way, and not just by some natural disaster, but by some kind of disruptive event, whether it's a malware attack or what have you, that would get in and provide that kind of disruption. If I were an IT person, this would concern me a little bit, because when you have certainly you could look at this and say, well, yeah, it's probably the most critical apps, and it probably is. But in many cases, to recover an application completely from scratch can take days or weeks. In some cases, even longer than that. And it then becomes those so-called non-critical applications become incredibly important, because the organization may be depending upon them for critical back office functionality, even if it's not normally time sensitive. It does when it's been out of commission for a long period of time. We then ask how many applications are being protected using public cloud for data protection. And here you can see the largest number is 25 to 49. But what we're finding in our other research with an IDC is that I think we've really reached a turning point, or a point in time when organizations are now using or very serious about using public cloud. For a long time, there was concern about using public cloud for data protection or other purposes because of security, maybe governance. There are a number of reasons people don't use the cloud for data protection. But we find that mindset shifting fairly rapidly, where organizations are now saying, yeah, you know what, it makes sense. It gets data off-site, for one thing. Gives us the ability to recover really our applications on a seamless basis, and it gives us a chance to move these applications to another location and recover them faster and at a much lower cost than we would be able to do on site. This particular question that we asked was around disaster recovery documentation. And this slide here, also from an IT perspective, would concern me. And that is less than 60% had some kind of IT staff contingency plan. And remember, disaster recovery is really the classic example of people, process, and technology. And technology certainly can and certainly is improving in terms of its ability to compensate for people and processes, but you can never forget about them. If you look down there towards the bottom, we found that only 23.6% of organizations have runbooks. To me, runbooks have traditionally been foundational to disaster recovery. But what this tells me is that organizations, if you don't have runbooks, you really need orchestration tools that can bring these applications back online, that will do the boot order sequencing, that will do the data migration, will do the workload migration. There really needs to be automated tools, especially when you take this slide in its totality with respect to really what I think is a real shortage of DR preparedness and documentation. You have to have that kind of technology and those kinds of modern tools that will help you to recover from any kind of disruption, again, regardless of what that source of disruption may be. Now I want to go into a little bit more about some of the knowledge gaps and team issues with respect to this findings from this survey. And here we ask how organizations are addressing data demand requirements. What we asked them was, is your organization seeing more or less or about the same demand for data? What we find here is 10% of the organization's demands are actually decreasing according to what they reported to us. And honestly, you show me an organization whose data demand is decreasing, and I'll show you an organization that is probably in trouble. I'm willing to make that statement. So, but still, nevertheless, there are always some of those organizations that don't regard it as highly important. On the other side of the curve, we see that 34.8% say my organization's demands are increasing somewhat, and 14.4% see them increasing significantly. As we go to this next slide, you'll see a high correlation here between the value that business leaders place on data, where organizations that place high value on data, I would say, are also those ones that see more and more demand for that data. So from a business leader perspective, if you look at the question that we have here, we say, for example, my organization's business leaders believe there is no correlation between the quality and availability of data and organizational success on one end of the spectrum, up to my organization's business leaders believe there's a high correlation between quality and availability of data and organizational success. So what this tells you is IT really delivers what the organization wants. If the organization wants better, more complete information, IT is going to be there to deliver it, but it has to be driven from the top. And I think this is where there needs to be a connection between what business leaders and their expectations are with respect to data and how they can use data to be competitive versus those organizations that simply don't regard data as a competitive weapon. So here's a self-assessment, and really the question is, where would you guys fit on this scale? Again, a high correlation here, where business and IT initiatives for IT resilience are disconnected and poorly aligned with enterprise strategy. Down to the bottom, that's again, it's that 10% of organizations that don't value data, don't see data increasing in needs, compared to the 8.4% who say the enterprise, both business and IT leaders, are aggressively disruptive in the use of new digital technologies and business models to affect maximum IT resilience. What that tells me is the 8.4% of organizations are disrupting the 91.6% of other organizations. And the question is, do you want to be the disruptor or do you want to be the disruptee? The reality is most organizations are the disruptee, meaning they are responding to market leaders' initiatives, they're behind the curve, and so on and so forth. And organizations really, in my opinion, need to take a look at this and say, how can we become the disruptors to the organization? How can we have that kind of resilience and availability and data-driven organizations that will lead to greater competitiveness, growth, profits, and all the other good things that go along with it. Another self-assessment point here would be with respect to business resilience. So the last one was IT resilience. This one is business resilience, and this is where business and IT initiatives for resilience are disconnected and poorly aligned. Interestingly, this one, when you're at the bottom of the curve, this one jumped up to 19%. So went beyond the 10% of organizations that felt that data wasn't important. So there's a gap here between where organizations believe they are in terms of IT resilience versus where they believe they are in business resilience. At the top end, there's not that much difference. So, statistically, the difference between 8.4 and 7.4 isn't that much. It really isn't statistically significant. So I believe there is a high correlation between those who are both IT resilient and those who are business resilient. And certainly you cannot, in many ways, it's hard to be one without the other. So it's important that organizations connect those two things together in order to increase their competitiveness. One of the things that we look at, certainly from a best practice perspective within IDC, is how are organizational teams organized? So we ask how many have these teams. 51% have an IT group, but a relatively small number have the IT line of business representatives and an executive sponsor. That's 12.6%. You can pretty well figure that that's the 8.4% that are resilient and the next 4% who are trying to get there. So we think this is an important indicator. We also look at the frequency of DR testing as an indicator. We believe that testing on a monthly basis is a best practice. Again, you're at about that 15%. You can see that a relative minority of organizations achieve this kind of best practice. We also look at the percent of IT budget spend on resilience infrastructure. Now, I can't tell you that IDC has any particular type of best practice with this regard, but I think it is important for IT leaders to look at this and business leaders to look at this and see where they are with respect to their peers. So this is kind of a moment to be able to look at peer spending and what other organizations are. You can see that the sweet spot for this particular bell curve is at the 11% to 15% of the IT budget being spent on business resilience. That'll vary a little bit by industry, but I think it gives you a benchmark to look at to say, are we spending enough? Are we doing enough to be competitive compared to our peers? You can also look at this from a peer perspective and say what technologies are currently deployed. 55% of organizations use cloud backup and 44% use cloud archive. Again, is this something that your organization should be doing? Is it something you've been considering? Is it a way that you can drive competitiveness, greater competitiveness, either through cost improvement or through resilience or agility within the ability to keep applications and data available to the organization? Then we ask about the importance of cloud data protection to the data protection scheme. Very small number said we don't use public cloud, 5.6%. 38% said public cloud will play an important role, and 19% said it will play a highly important role. Again, I think we've reached that crossover point where public cloud is now becoming very much an accepted mechanism for protecting data and providing that kind of data availability. We ask what role cloud will play in disaster recovery schemes, and for 90% of organizations, you can see here that it does play some kind of role, whether the only 9.4% said it didn't play a role at all in their disaster recovery schemes, 48.4% said it did play an important or central role in their disaster recovery. And really, cloud has fundamentally changed the economics of disaster recovery. Being able to get on-demand access to resources, as well as being able to do workload migration from on-premise to off-premise are critical functions for providing that kind of application availability. Again, I stress that organizations should go beyond disaster recovery, not just look at recovering from a once-in-a-lifetime event, but really going on to looking at it from a perspective of continuous application availability. Here's another opportunity for self-assessment, and that is that IT staff levels and skills expectations for organizations in the next 2 years. You can see here when we ask this of respondents, 85% say they need either more staff, more training, or both. So that's a very significant gap, certainly, that people expect within the next 2 years. That's not a long time horizon. So as organizations embark upon IT transformation and digital transformation, filling those skills gaps, either through recruiting or training or whatever it might happen to be, are very important parts of being able to provide that kind of IT response. So to bring together the conclusions for this, we really have 6 of them. First is IT and business disruptors affect nearly every organization. If you look at, 90% have been hit, 77% have been disrupted, 49% have lost data, 48% have been disrupted by competitive business models. I mean, it is an absolute flurry or a bombardment of change and disruptors that are simply a fact of life that businesses and business leaders, IT leaders, everybody has to deal with. IT and business resilience are really core to digital transformation. I would certainly say that you cannot achieve digital transformation without first going through IT transformation and having business resilience as part of that fundamental capability. Third is external attacks are inevitable, but negative impacts don't have to be inevitable. If you properly prepare and you have the right tools and the right infrastructure components and architecture, you can certainly recover much more rapidly than your peers would be able to recover in the event of some kind of attack. But we found that very few organizations are really fully prepared for a significant IT outage. When you look at some of the gaps with respect to applications that are covered by some kind of DR plan, or the inability of organizations to always recover data, we think those are issues and problems that IT organizations really need to self-examine and see where they are with respect to those issues and improve it. Fifth is cloud will play a significant role in IT resilience. I think part of that is because it gets data offsite, for one thing. It used to be transferring tapes offsite. Some people still do, and nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't provide the kind of resilience or rapid recovery that the cloud can offer in terms of on-demand resources, as well as some of the capabilities of some modern-day solutions that can very easily and quickly migrate workloads from on-premise to off-premise and really recover in a matter of seconds or minutes. And then six is the companies need to plan and solve for skills gaps and training gaps in achieving IT resilience. Remember, this is all about people, process, and technology. You have to look at all three of them and understand how each one of them is going to be addressed. There is no single technological silver bullet. Technology is getting better all the time. Applications are coming in and making this better and better and more possible. But it's always going to require people with skills to really make them work. So that takes us to the top three recommendations from IDC. And the number one recommendation that we have here is that companies should regard data protection not just as data recovery, but as an enabling technology for business agility, competitiveness, and resilience. It's no longer just recovering data. It's really how do you keep that application running so that business units can do their jobs and customers can engage with your company and conduct business. Number two is IT resilience and data availability must be a top priority, really because IT transformation and digital transformation are not possible without them. And then third is use benchmarking as a means of evaluating organizational and IT resilience and establish a plan to move up the maturity curve. We've given you some of these maturity scales, and those of you who are IDC clients perhaps have access to some recently published disaster recovery benchmark and maturity scales. Certainly encourage you to use those if you have them available to you. But even if you just use the data that's in this particular presentation, it will tell you that the kinds of things to look for in moving up that maturity curve. No one moves up the maturity curve in a year. It's just, it's too heavy of a lift. There are too many components, too many things. But depending on where you're starting on that curve, it really should be a 1 to 5 year project. If you're right at the bottom and very immature, it's probably going to take you about 5 years. If you're kind of starting in the middle, where the majority of organizations are, you can really get pretty close to that highly mature, highly competitive segment of really the elite level organizations, typically within about 2 to 3 years. So with that, hopefully that's given you guys some data to work with. Certainly threw a ton of statistics out at you. I think the real takeaways are that the need for IT resilience is very much at the beginning, or should be top of mind for IT organizations, especially for those organizations that are attempting to become among the elite of their industry. So with that, I want to open this back up to Avi, bring you back into the conversation, Avi, and also to let people know what's available to them.
Cool, Phil, thank you very much. So one question for you is, IDC does a lot of research. What about this study really stood out?
You know, that's an interesting one, Avi, because I think of the research we've done, we found that 70% of organizations have some kind of digital transformation initiative that's been articulated by their senior management. But I think what that tells you is that there's a significant gap between the aspirations of organizations to transform themselves digitally and their preparedness to do so at an IT level and at a business resilience and IT resilience level. So I think those of us in the IT industry, we have a lot of work to do with respect to getting our organizations up to that kind of level, which kind of raises a question for me that I might have for you, Avi. I mean, you're a CIO. You've been a CIO in other organizations. Kind of what do you see as the priorities for CIOs, and what kind of guidance would you have for your peers that are on the call today?
Thanks, Phil. So let's start with the first question of CIO priorities. I think they're fairly similar in most organizations. I would start with driving operational excellence or leading transformation. Of course, it's about bringing the right technology, but just like you said, it's not only about technology. You must design the right business process and also focus on the people who will use the tools eventually. Security, of course, is foundational, and I think with all the insight you shared, it is something that every CIO must invest in to make sure he is protected as much as possible, but also understand that in the end something probably will get in, and you need the ability to detect, to respond, and to recover in a timely manner. I think you also touched the data, and I think CIO has great opportunity to help the organization unlock the power of data and find ways to leverage the data assets within the organization and create the culture of a data-driven organization. I think cloud, of course, is on everybody's mind, and we all see a shift towards a hybrid multi-cloud world, and everybody who is not on that journey should start. And last, I would say there is a number of emerging disruptive technologies like machine learning, AI, blockchain, and CIOs need to find the right use case to adapt them within the organization, not for the sake of implementing cool technology, but to generate the disruptive business value that they might offer. As for your second question of what advice I have for peer CIOs and IT organizations, I think it's very clear from the research that the situation is concerning regarding IT resilience. Many organizations do not have the right technology to protect themselves in this evolving digital area. And I believe a new approach to IT and business resilience is required. As a first step, I recommend to make sure that the IT and business are fully aligned on the expectations for resilience. What is the RPO and RTO SLA that is expected by the business? Then I would search for the right technology. And from my experience, simply buying another product to fix the issue only creates more problems and still leaves the business vulnerable and unprotected from technology disruptions and malicious attacks. I advise IT teams to focus on simplifying their technology portfolio and searching out a converged solution. One solution that can manage their entire resilience operation, cloud mobility, backup, and disaster recovery from a single viewpoint. And I think today there are products such as the Zerto product that can really simplify the technology needed to be protected. Like you said, I think it's a very good idea to look at how cloud can be part of the resiliency solution and how it can accelerate the journey towards being resilient. And last but not least, it is critical to really test it. I mean, it's fun to have a yearly exercise that conceptually shows you are protected, but I believe that it is critical to really test it and do a full failover test to really give you the peace of mind that you will be fully able to recover and move applications and data workloads within seconds of an event happening.
I could not agree more with that, Avi. I think that is certainly one of the key indicators of a fully mature organization being able to do that. To follow up a little bit, what do you see, or what can you tell us about Zerto's journey to digital transformation and then modernization?
I would say, of course, like every organization, we are going through IT transformation and putting more and more into of the business and internal operations on the IT infrastructure and applications. And as part of that, of course, we are very concerned to be IT resilient. And fortunately for us, we have our own product to rely on. So obviously, we can rest a little easier knowing that our infrastructure is resilient and that if something happens, we can recover and move the applications and data workloads within really seconds of an event. I would also say that we use our own product to help us in our journey towards the hybrid multi-cloud. Using the Zerto product, we are able to easily mobilize workloads from our on-premise data center to the public cloud and even between public clouds if needed. And that supports our hybrid multi-cloud strategy.
Sounds like you guys sip your own champagne, so to speak.
Yeah, of course, we do. One final question for you. There's a lot of information and recommendations in today's webinar. What should IT organizations prioritize from your perspective?
Okay. Yeah, where I would suggest IT organizations start is really from the foundation, which is take a look at your risk and readiness, do an assessment of risk and readiness. Organizations too often don't do that very formally. When I was a consultant, we did that a lot with organizations to help them understand where they sat with respect to the threats that they faced, which vary by industry, they vary by geography, they vary by a number of things. And so understanding what that assessment is, I think is very important. Then do some benchmarking exercises. You know, the simple thing, where are your peers? To me, every organization should be seeking to be among the elite who are driving the change in their industry, not just reacting to it. So one of the ways to do that is to look at your IT resiliency maturity as well as your business resilience maturity, and they're slightly different, as we talked about in the presentation, and try to move up that curve and put together a plan that is documented, is supported by senior management, and that can be reviewed from time to time to make sure that you're hitting those key performance indicators. But as I talked about a little bit, Avi, this really comes from the senior business leaders. IT will do what's required of them, and they will meet the business's needs. I find that very consistently. And when the business is looking to be more competitive or hyper competitive and to drive that kind of change in their industry, IT is right there along with them. So it's that alignment that we see between business goals and IT goals where you get into that top elite 8, if you will, elite 8% of organizations that are driving that kind of change.
Thank you, Phil. I think you're spot on. So I would like to wrap up as we're running out of time. So first, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today for the discussion about the state of IT resilience. I would like to thank again the IDC team for conducting the study and Phil for walking us through the finding. Reminder to everyone who joined, you are expected to receive a copy of the IDC report as soon as it is finalized. And don't forget to visit zerto.com for more information. Thank you and goodbye.